It's a form of modern slavery. It's one of the fastest growing criminal activities in the world. It's estimated that there are 4.5 million people a year who are victims of human trafficking, modern slavery. About $150 billion in profits are made through this concept, and it's not new. Some of us, however, are unaware of the impact and the extent of this human trafficking here in the 21st century. The good news is that you can play a part in helping to make people aware of this crime through public education, knowledge of the red flags and victim indicators, and building strong relationships with law enforcement and especially financial industry. And you're building those relationships here today. So, we have an expert in this field. She is Margie Quinn, Assistant Special Agent in charge of the Tennessee Fusion Center with the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. And please welcome Margie.
No?
There you go. Now you're on.
Good afternoon. My name is Margie Williams. I'm Margie Quinn, and I'm from Nashville, so I'm thrilled to be here. Margaret sent me a lot of emails in the last few days and over the last week, convinced me that the slot after lunch was the best time to talk. Well, and I see that you guys are in some sort of like carb coma at this point with the pasta and the chocolate. So, but we're going to talk about trafficking. We're going to talk about trafficking, labor trafficking, whether or not elder abuse and elder exploitation could be considered trafficking. This is an emerging issue. It's one that's being talked about quite a bit across not only our country, but the world. I'm going to put some information before you. I don't know of any elderly trafficking cases that have been prosecuted, but that's not to say that there's not about to be a first one. I got to listen to the last speaker in his presentation. He seems like the kind of guy that would go right after this if he thought the elements of the crime were met. So let's just jump right in. Not going to go. Nope. Can you click go on that? There you go. So I think every single one of us would recognize that that's trafficking, right? That's the red light district in Amsterdam. We all understand that if women are in cages or children are in cages or if the elderly were put in cages and put out in front of the public, we would recognize that as trafficking, exploitation. But does it happen here in the United States? That's been the real shift in thinking, I think, in the last probably 10 years, is the amount of trafficking that's occurring right here in the United States. The TVPA, the Trafficking for Victims Protection Act, passed the United States Congress in 2000. So we're not talking about a law that's been around for a real long time. Now, are the crimes that are being committed against individuals new? No, they're not new. But the way we define them in the code is new. Our TCA, our Tennessee Code Annotated, came along about 7 years later, passed in 2007. We've made some adjustments to that in the last couple of years, but they basically mirror one another. And what the TVPA says, as well as the TCA, is that when a person is over the age of 18, I'm in a box right here, when a person is over the age of 18, engages in a commercial sex act by means of force, fraud, or coercion, that is human trafficking. Over 18, a commercial sex act, force, fraud, or coercion. That's it. Under 18 years of age, a commercial sex act occurs, period. The government does not need to prove force or fraud or coercion, just that a commercial sex act occurred. Now, what is a commercial sex act? It's a sex act that occurs when something of value is exchanged. Something of value. So what's value? Money. What else? Drugs. What else? Property. Shelter. Food. Anything in exchange for sex, anything of value in exchange for sex, makes that a commercial sex act. And when the person is under the age of 18, that's a per se crime. In other words, we don't have to prove anything else. Now, force, fraud, or coercion, when it comes to the commercial sex industry, I've been in law enforcement almost 26 years. I spent about 5.5 years in patrol in the Atlanta area. I never met a prostitute that hadn't been beat up. She's got a pimp. She's trafficked. I'm going to tell you she is. Okay? Labor trafficking is a little different. Let me go back and say that sex trafficking over the age of 18 is a B felony. Under the age of 15 is an A felony. Now, 6 years ago in this state, it was a misdemeanor to sell a 14-year-old girl for sex in this state. A misdemeanor. And we charged the 14-year-old with prostitution. We were one of the first 7 states in the nation to decriminalize prostitution for minors. We did it in 2011. I felt like we needed to start as we meant to go on. We need to define clearly who the victims are and who the criminals are. 14-year-old girl, not a criminal, because she's being forced into prostitution. Now, labor trafficking is a B or C felony. It's a little more difficult. The ways that occurs, a little more difficult to understand. It's a forced labor by means of force, fraud, or coercion. And the way you prove that is an individual is separated from their documents, driver's license, passport, birth certificates. They're made to work long hours, not compensated for the work that they do. Debt bondage. One of the more interesting cases that we've been working lately is the spa cases. And if you drive anywhere on I-40, you'll see these big billboards that say spas. Those are not spas. Do not get the wife a gift card from there for Christmas. She does not want a massage with a happy ending. Now, I'll tell you that some of the women that we have recovered in these spas have been in their 60s. There are no juveniles that we have found in these spas, and we have raided and shut down 30 or more across the state in the last 4 or 5 years. Now, the interesting part about the spas is if you are told that the work you're going to do is sex, it'd be hard to prove sex trafficking. But if you're separated from your papers, made to live on site, not compensated for the work that you do, it's labor trafficking. It's sexualized labor, the dance clubs, the stripping. These are sexualized labor, but it's labor trafficking. One of the things that I think gets misconstrued more often than not is the idea of the difference between smuggling and trafficking. So smuggling is a crime against the United States border. I'm sure we all saw in the news that horrific case down in Texas where all those people were found deceased in that tractor trailer. That's smuggling. Trafficking is a crime against a person. Now, were those people going to be later trafficked? Possibly. But that's a very obvious smuggling case on its face. You'd have to do some work to prove trafficking. Here we go. So when we talk about trafficking, we're going to talk a little bit about vulnerable populations. And this is where I think I want you to start thinking about these vulnerable populations as they relate to the elderly. And see if most of these descriptors don't also or couldn't also describe a vulnerable elderly person. Modern day slavery, a crime that involves exploitation of a person for the purposes of compelled sex or labor. Trafficking victims can be anyone, regardless of race, color, national origin, disability, religion, age, gender, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, education, citizenship status. So could all of those descriptors apply to an elderly person just as well as they could to a 14-year-old or a 50-year-old? Of course they could. So elderly trafficking could fall into these descriptors. I don't know if I'm too far away. There we go. Oh, one too many. So these are the characteristics of the trafficking victim. I have worked in this field now with trafficking, with the TBI for, well, as long as we've been working it, as long as we've known that it's been around, 10 years. These apply to every victim, and I've probably talked to more than 100 victims in the last 10 years, well in excess of 100 victims of trafficking. They're poor, they're vulnerable, they're living in unsafe situations, they're in search of a better life, they're drug addicted. I'd say that's 95%. Are elderly individuals dependent upon medication? Yes, of course they are. Abusive past. The elderly are abused, I think, at a much higher rate than we would like to believe. Native communities, LGBTQ, disabilities, undocumented immigrants, undocumented runaway youth, that one wouldn't apply, but impoverished. Although I would argue to you that the majority of the elderly who would be or could be trafficking victims probably have a tremendous amount of assets, because trafficking is about money. That's about making money. It's not about anything else. Trafficking is about the sale of a commodity. Okay? It's the profit off of an individual. Just like drug trafficking is profit off of a drug, or gun trafficking, weapons trafficking. Only unlike weapons and drugs that you can only sell one time, you can sell a person or exploit that person over and over and over and over and over again. So in the case of an elderly person, they're getting checks every month, right? They're going to get that check over and over and over and over. And the exploitation would just continue. In preparation for this presentation, because it's different than the ones that I usually do, I looked at a string of articles. And again, this is a very emerging topic. In this particular article that I've cited some in the presentation, and I'm going to read you just a little bit of it, was published September 13th of 2017. And it's, I think it's really applicable to the discussion that we're going to have today. As the 71st session of the General Assembly of the United Nations begins this week to discuss international issues that affect the lives of millions throughout the world, the United States needs to step up its commitment to safeguard human rights and promote the rule of law in its own backyard, specifically escalating abuse in the U.S. elder guardianship system. So most of the information that I found about elderly trafficking really had to do with this idea of guardianship. It is a huge emerging industry, unfortunately. Can we go one more? There we go. Oh, one too far. So here are some obvious types of elderly abuse: physical abuse, sexual abuse, financial abuse. You just heard all about that with the previous speaker. Social, forcing isolation, restricting phone calls, visitors, etc. And this is, I will tell you from a personal standpoint, something that is sort of near and dear to my heart, because my mother is a 77-year-old with advanced Alzheimer's. I moved her in with me. She lived with my husband and my daughter and I for 3 years until she couldn't stay alone anymore in the house, and then I moved her into a facility. But you have to watch them, even in the really reputable facilities, I think. I've had to move her once because I didn't like the care that she was getting. And we were very fortunate because my mother had the money and the long-term care insurance to take care of her. But imagine if you had an elderly person who didn't have family infrastructure, or at least family that was willing to do the right thing by their parent. It becomes a very, very scary situation. Emotional abuse and neglect, taking shortcuts, limiting access to necessities, etc. Can we go one? Is elder guardianship a new form of trafficking? I'm going to go back to this article. According to the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, Article 3, Paragraph A of the Protocol to Prevent, Suppress, and Punish Trafficking in Persons, defines trafficking in persons as the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of persons by means of the threat of use of force or other forms of coercion, abduction, fraud, deception, the abuse of power, position of vulnerability, or the giving or receiving of payments or benefits to achieve the consent of a person having control over another person. That sounds like guardianship, right? For the purpose of exploitation, exploitation shall include at a minimum the exploitation of prostitution of others or other forms of sexual exploitation, forced labor or services, slavery or practices similar to slavery. That's what I think this elder trafficking would probably hinge on. Whether or not you could prove slavery or elements of slavery. And I think you'd probably need a really good, aggressive prosecutor to take a case like that on, depending on the facts and circumstances of that particular case. It wouldn't take much to tweak these code sections to include elder guardianship abuse. It certainly wouldn't. I think we're probably teetering on the precipice of whether or not you could prove trafficking. You can certainly prove a whole host of other issues, but the trafficking part right now really is dependent upon forced labor or sex. But that idea of slavery would certainly seem to apply. Can we move one forward? In 2013, an AARP report gave a best guess estimate of the number of adults under guardianship nationally at 1.5 million. Idaho and Minnesota are the only states that track the amount of money being controlled by guardians, which I thought was really interesting. The combined total for just 2 states is over $1 billion. So again, this is just about making money, and there's a lot of money on the table from these seniors, both in what they have in assets, whether that's in real property, accounts, IRAs, Social Security checks, benefits. There's a tremendous amount of money. I know people who have worked for me and with me at the TBI whose family members were the subject of theft and abuse. It can happen to any of us if we're not watching. Again, this is about the exploitation of a vulnerable person. Can we go one? Exploitation, prostitution, commercial sex, forced labor or services, slavery or practices similar to slavery, servitude or removal of organs. Organ trafficking is something I think that happens more overseas than it does here. But I've been in law enforcement so long, you really probably couldn't surprise me if you said there was a deep underground network of like organ stealers that was making a bunch of money. There's no telling these days. But again, I think it hinges on that slavery or practices similar to slavery. Can you go one forward again? So you have 3 elements necessary to prove this crime. The act, what is done, transfer or harbor of a person. I think we're there on that with guardians. The means, how it is done, abduction, deception, abuse of power or vulnerability. Certainly elderly people are very vulnerable to being deceived, coerced, scammed. The purpose, why is it done? In the case of guardianship, the purpose is financial exploitation, a form of servitude. Again, I think we're really close. I thought this quote by Pope Francis was very pertinent. Human trafficking is an open wound on the body of contemporary society, a scourge upon the body of Christ. It is a crime against humanity. All trafficking is a crime against humanity. But when you exploit those vulnerable populations, like children or the elderly who cannot care for themselves, it sort of goes the extra mile. Can we go forward one?
My trafficker was my husband. There was no way I could reach out to anybody for help.
We're scared. We're scared to run. We're scared to tell anybody what's going on.
It was an incredibly violent situation. I felt like there was no way I could get out.
It was our fault. Whole experience.
I was full-time babysitter and house cleaning, cooking. I wasn't getting paid. I was lied to, I was abused. I didn't know I was a victim of human trafficking until I told my story.
Human trafficking is really compelling someone to any form of work or service against their will.
Force, fraud, and coercion is really the crux of the crime.
Human traffickers can be just about anyone from any walk of life. Owners of small businesses, head of a household. A lot of the trafficking involves domestic servitude. Hoteliers, restaurant owners, owners of massage parlors, agricultural farm owners,
It can be a trafficker who tells a woman, I want to be your boyfriend, I love you, and if you love me, you're going to go out and have sex for money. It can be kind of psychological like that, or it can be more overt, more physical. It can be hitting, abusing, keeping them away from any support systems.
They may have their documents taken away from them, their passport, things like that, and they're sort of held in a way that makes them fearful to complain. And if they do complain, then they're fired.
One myth about trafficking is that it involves people being smuggled in containers across borders. Smuggling is a crime against a border. Trafficking is a crime against a person.
I still see this attitude of it's just immigrants or it's just people in other countries. It happens to U.S. citizens so much more than people are aware.
There really is no one profile of a trafficked person. There are clearly themes or patterns, but if you look through the investigation reports, you'll see cases that are very, very diverse.
Trafficking doesn't know any boundaries. And it happens all over America. So I came from kind of a more privileged background, but it still happened to me, and a male. The victim can be male, female, transgendered, anyone.
There's a myth out there, partly because of movies, that trafficking victims are chained up, and that's not the case, but it doesn't make the victim any less unable to leave. Oftentimes they're worried for their family members. Traffickers will often say, I know people that will do things to them.
We need to understand that freedom of movement does not equal freedom of choice. Most of the time, being trapped is something we can't see. It's something that the trafficker pinpoints as a vulnerability and is able to use against the victim.
You're initially brainwashed, and then over a period of time you become conditioned where you start to accept that this is all you can do.
The natural stakeholders in this issue are certainly law enforcement, legal advocates, social service providers. There's other players involved as well.
It is important to engage the community in human trafficking cases because victims often don't self-identify. They don't come forward to law enforcement.
Thank you. Bye-bye. We try to make sure the community is educated regarding human trafficking because those citizens in the community are the eyes and the ears.
It's medical workers, it's educators, it's personnel at homeless shelters.
There has to be a support system within the community, psychological counseling, shelter, and vocational education so they can reintegrate, become a healthy individual.
We can't do this alone. No one has the capacity to provide every single thing that a victim or survivor of human trafficking needs.
There's an intentional effort to get everyone together so we know how to share resources, we know how to work together to make sure at the end of the day, a victim becomes a survivor.
So trafficking involves psychological coercion to render someone a slave. That could happen to anyone. It could happen to anyone in this room. It could happen to anyone of a vulnerable population. To do this, perpetrators employ tactics that can lead to psychological consequences of learned helplessness for victims, where they sense that they no longer have any autonomy or control over their lives. Again, I'll reference back to my 77-year-old mother with advanced Alzheimer's. Dementia patients and Alzheimer's and the elderly make them incredibly vulnerable. If they do not have family members that can be trusted, and family members cannot always be trusted. When I go out and talk about, I'm the statewide Amber Alert coordinator, so I do a lot of speaking on missing children and child abduction. If a child is harmed or murdered, who's most likely the culprit statistically? Their parents, right? So we shouldn't make an assumption that family are always what's best for anybody in a vulnerable situation, unfortunately. Unfortunately. Traffickers may hold their victims captive, expose them to large amounts of alcohol or use of drugs, keep them in isolation or withhold food or sleep. During this time, the victim often begins to feel the onset of depression, guilt, self-blame, anger, rage, sleeplessness, PTSD, numbing, and extreme stress. Under these pressures, the victim can fall into the hopeless mental state of learned helplessness. An argument can be made that the liquidate, isolate, and medicate elder guardianship process is trafficking. That's it, liquidate, isolate, and medicate. In most states, it doesn't require much to render a person incapable. We never had to do that with my mother because she passed into a state where, I was her power of attorney. We had already set up my access to her financial assets. We never had to go. The biggest problem we had was in me taking her car away from her, as you can imagine. Elders, they don't like that. But I've lived in fear of, asking for some sort of silver alert for my mother. Just like I have an 11-year-old, I live in fear of having to issue an Amber Alert for my own child. That was just not going to happen to me. But I think family members also are in denial about what their elders are capable of. Every single day I see bolos come across my desk that, Mr. Johnson, who's gone to the same grocery store every Thursday for the last 30 years, this Thursday ends up in Louisville. It happens just that fast. So quickly. And in the next year or so, they're saying 10,000 adults a year age into senior citizenship with the boomers. This is an escalating epidemic, emergency issue for our population here in the United States. I think this type of conference is a great place to start the dialogue about whether or not we have the laws in place and on the books to do what we need to do to protect the vulnerable elderly. Do the laws address adequately elder abuse that's occurring in our state? Is guardianship a new form of trafficking? Is that something we need to address in our state? Since 2010, I've either testified in front of our legislature or been consulted on the passage of 43 new pieces of legislation that impact our trafficking laws, our commercial sexual exploitation of children's laws, silver alert, and so forth. I'm asking you all are the experts in this particular field. Are the laws that we have on the books adequate to address the emerging need? No, they may not be. But this body and this entity is probably who needs to get together and speak up about whether or not we need to change some things in the law. Add or take away, redefine. If the laws that we had on the books were adequate, we would have sat one legislature, right, one General Assembly about 200 years ago and called it a done deal. We'd been done. But that's not the case. We come back every year and we look at whether or not the laws are adequate to protect the individuals and the citizens and the vulnerable populations in our state. So what I hope to accomplish, besides maybe confusing you about some issues, is to put this question before you. Is guardianship, is the financial exploitation of an elderly person trafficking? Should it be? It's not clear enough in the code at this time. And if it's not, what are we going to do about it? Do you all have questions or anything you want to ask or discuss with the group? Not a lot. Probably depends on which state you're in. And those don't have to be family members. I read a statistic, I think in Florida, it's the fastest growing employment opportunity in the state of Florida. And you can imagine why, right? I mean, you drive through Florida, you're going to see, I mean, there's a silver alert going every day in Florida. What else? Anything? Yes, sir. Repeat the first part of that question.
You were asking a question about whether guardianship is or use of guardianship for children trafficking. And I'm asking why we've got existing laws that define a prosecutor as financial exploitation. Why do you need to have that trafficking?
Well, and that's certainly a question. Because when I'm looking at whether or not to charge an individual for the trafficking of a 12-year-old or younger, a better charge is child rape because it's 25 years at 100%, right? It doesn't always mean that you're going to use that. I mean, there are certainly other TCAs that would be applicable for a lot of this, but they don't have a lot of teeth to them. And when you exploit, and I've seen it over and over again, just in families at the TBI, the caregiver or the guardian sort of gets slapped on the wrist, might have to pay some percentage of restitution. I mean, does the punishment fit the crime? I guess. And in the more severe cases, where you have a lot of physical abuse or neglect, is a theft charge at a C felony, does that really fit the crime? Because what we're trying to do with any TCA, and what I talked a lot about when we strengthened the laws on sex trafficking for kids, is you've got to make the crime, you've got to reverse the risk reward, right? If there's a low risk and a high reward, a lot of people are going to commit that crime. Just like, we've got a lot of men in this state that are purchasing women for sex. I can put an ad up on Backpage and get 300 men in Knoxville to call that ad tonight. One ad, one woman. That's because the risk is very low and the reward is very high. But when we flip that, we make the risk very high and the reward very low, that's when you start to deter crime. And you can only do that if you increase the risk associated or the punishment associated with a crime. And I guess my long answer to that is a theft charge, even a felony theft charge, is it adequate for what's really happened to that elderly person? Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Oh, is that kidnapping? And is it going to get charged out that way by a prosecutor? It could be a form, yes. But also I think whenever you talk about passing new laws or using the TCA in a different way, in other words, if you charge that person with theft and kidnapping and aggravated assault, well, then they're probably going to get what they deserve. But typically, they're just going to be charged with theft, right? So maybe some of this is education. Some of these conversations need to happen with prosecutors and judges about what does the TCA allow us to do at this point in our more severe cases? Or is it trafficking? I'll be around for a few minutes after we finish here. If anybody has any questions, please come up and talk to me. Thank you for having me.